The war in Ukraine, conflicts in the Middle East, and Africa are about to have a crossover episode. Ukrainian special forces aren't just fighting Russian soldiers on the front lines at home anymore. They're now engaging them in both Syria and Sudan.
The Ukrainian forces have struck Wagner-backed fighters inside Sudan.
In June 2024, the Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate (HUR) released footage showing their special operators coordinating with Syrian opposition rebels. Together, they launched attacks on Russian forces inside Syria. They hit Russian checkpoints, ammunition storage depots, and logistics convoys that were filled with supplies. Then Russian foot patrols were ambushed with small arms fire. The main strategy they appear to be using is guerrilla warfare, with IEDs and RPG strikes. Since these Ukrainian commandos have no direct line to resupply for weapons or equipment, they've had to improvise. They reportedly created makeshift mortar tubes put together in-country to be used against Russian defensive positions. But how did the Ukrainian Special Forces team insert into Syria in the first place? It's nearly 1,000 miles away from Ukraine. You can't just hop on a plane from Kyiv and fly directly to Damascus airport without raising a couple of eyebrows. They could have been transported through various clandestine methods and channels. A team could jump on a commercial vessel and sail south through the Black Sea, then stop in Turkey before traveling over land into Syria. They could have flown into Iraq and then traveled over land where there's friendly checkpoints controlled by nations that are aligned with them all along that route. The war in Ukraine continues to rage on, which has led many to wonder why Ukraine would pull specialized troops away from the front lines and send them across the world to a seemingly unrelated conflict, especially when Ukraine is facing widely reported manpower shortages on the front lines. There are several plausible scenarios for what their goals might be that we're going to get into. Matthew Orr is a Eurasia analyst at risk intelligence company Rain. He spoke to a publication called The New Arab, discussing the logic behind these operations, saying, quote, "Kyiv likely believes that the few resources spent exaggerating the mere threat of such attacks on Russian interests in Sudan open the possibility of similar attacks across Russian activities in the Middle East and Africa, forcing Moscow to expend disproportionate resources to secure against such activities in new geographies." And there's some evidence to suggest this might already be happening, because in April 2024, a few months after the attack started, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that they were sending additional troops to their positions inside Syria, specifically in the Golan Heights. This is exactly where the Ukrainian SF units are allegedly operating, according to reports and geolocated footage. The majority of these battles are taking place in this sensitive, disputed region in southwest Syria, bordering Israel. According to open source intelligence reports, this is where most of the Russian mercenaries, troops, and police are currently concentrated. This is where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Ukrainian conflict start to blur lines. If you were to have guessed where Ukrainian special forces would strike at Russia inside Syria, you probably would have guessed from the Kurdish-controlled north, or possibly an attempt at hitting their less guarded oil fields in the central part of Syria. Since the start of 2024, Moscow's forces have been observed creating 3 new forward operating bases and 14 observation outposts on the Syrian-controlled side of the Golan Heights, on the border with Israel. Reports indicate that Russian police have started to regularly patrol and operate inside the province of Qinchar and Dara, which are immediately next to Israel's claimed border. This is a new development because it's the first time in recent history that Russian troops have set up only a few hundred feet away from Israeli Defense Forces positions. So why are Russian forces building up new bases and increasing manpower on the border with Israel? Mauricio Molinari wrote a great article for La Repubblica where he explained its connection to the war in Ukraine. Israel's having frequent clashes with Hezbollah and pro-Iranian militias in that region. This gives Russian intelligence officers the ability to easily observe Western weapon systems capabilities, both defensive and offensive. They can gather valuable data on these weapons, which are some of the same type of weapons that they're facing inside Ukraine. And so the Ukrainian special forces that are striking inside Golan Heights against Russia might also be attempting to disrupt Russian intelligence gathering abilities. In the past, Russia has used Wagner forces for plausible deniability of their operations inside Syria. But what we're witnessing in the Golan Heights is very different. Russia has visibly planted their flag. Molinari said in his article, quote, "Russia's acting with deliberate visibility, moving military vehicles, constructing installations, raising the flag, playing the national anthem, and manning bunkers old and new, from which they can clearly observe the Israeli civilian centers in front of them. Russian troops are specifically creating observation posts in strategic locations like Bir al-Ajam, which has a clear view of Israel. Up until now, Israel and Russia has had this kind of unspoken agreement where they largely do not interfere with each other in Syria. So what's so special about the Golan Heights that seems to have attracted 100 different factions from around the world to fight over? To oversimplify things, before 1967, the Golan Heights was part of Syria. Then, after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel captured it. In 1981, Israel annexed it, and since then, the United Nations and most countries around the world consider it to be Syrian territory occupied by Israel. Israel's occupied and administered the southwestern two-thirds of the Golan Heights. It's a hotly disputed region and a confusing tanglement of various factions and powers. So we have this situation where Russian and Syrian government troops are fighting against Syrian rebels and Ukrainian special forces in the north of the Golan Heights, while IDF troops are located just a few hundred kilometers away in the south. Russian troops have been deployed to Syria since 2015, with about 3,000 to 5,000 troops stationed there at any given time. This is a mix of Wagner mercenaries, conventional troops, and police units. Before the invasion of Ukraine, the only direct action combat formation inside Ukraine's intelligence agency was a small special reconnaissance unit, which aided in the evacuation of Afghanistan's Kabul airport in 2021. After the war broke out, though, the need for an expanded intelligence service with military capabilities caused them to rapidly increase their numbers to 23 separate groups. Each of these groups is tasked with a very specific mission set, such as direct action, field reconnaissance, drone operations, and a host of other secret squirrel stuff that probably won't be declassified for another 75 years. Sergei Sakonkin, a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, told Business Insider that the Ukrainian operations here in Syria may be part of some sort of tacit agreement between Western allies and Ukraine to battle Russian mercenaries in Africa and the Middle East, in exchange for certain military backing for Ukraine in its war against Russia. This scenario suggests that Ukrainian commandos have a kind of plausible deniability when it comes to their missions in the Golan Heights. The geopolitical connections don't stop there, though. Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, has directly compared the situation in the Golan Heights to the situation in Ukraine's Donbass. Since their invasion of Ukraine, Russia has established various recruitment centers throughout Syria, offering money to people to enlist and fight for them inside Ukraine. The Syrian mercenaries are then given Russian documents and flown from an airbase in Syria to Russia. The best data I could find on this comes from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that observed around 2,000 soldiers from Syria had been deployed to fight on the behalf of Russia inside Ukraine so far. So these operations could be in part to slow down mercenary recruitment there, although that certainly wouldn't explain it entirely given the relatively low numbers. Fighting Russia inside Syria might also grant Ukraine an asymmetrical warfare advantage. This is about economy of force. Movies and video games have us believing that special forces are only sent on the most dangerous secretive missions, and that a single operator is a one-man army who could hold back an entire assault. The reality is these elite forces will have more of an effect in a clandestine mission like this one than they would on the front lines. It's like how my old squad leader used to always call me a very special tool. He was, of course, saying that I'm good for specific missions, I think. But plans of these attacks are nothing new. A member on our Discord channel reached out to me and sent me a leaked, classified American intelligence analysis document. The documents have been widely reported on in the media, and I made sure anything I share here won't get me sent to prison, although I can't say the same for the guy who originally leaked it. The pages claim that Zelensky had ordered a halt, a cease of the plans to attack inside Syria way back in December of 2022. Apparently the plans were scuttled, partly because it would have been too complex of an operation to pull off at that point. The American intelligence analysis was written last year in 2023, and it outlines the possible ramifications of a Ukrainian special forces deployment inside Syria. The American intelligence analysis believed that this kind of development would be highly unlikely, because if it happened, it could lead to Russian forces responding by supporting attacks against US forces in Syria. It also stated that another reason this attack probably hadn't already happened is because the US government was pressuring Zelensky not to operate inside Syria. But it states that if the plans went forward, they would aim to inflict enough Russian casualties to force Russia to bring reinforcements that were fighting in Ukraine, and would likely start to target Russian-controlled oil infrastructure inside Syria with UAV strikes, similar to the kind of UAV strikes we've seen Ukraine do recently by hitting Russian oil refineries. Lieutenant General Kirilo Budilov said that he vowed to destroy Russian war criminals anywhere in the world, wherever they are. So it could be a morale move. Budilov is in charge of the intelligence agency, and he likely planned the strikes in Syria and Sudan. Budinov's role has been to hit Russia using unconventional tactics. The fighting isn't just in the Middle East though. We've also seen it in Africa as well. Videos surfaced of Ukrainian special forces battling it out in Sudan against Russian mercenaries and the RSF rebel group. A series of drone strikes hit Wagner-backed militia groups near the Sudan capital. Ukraine first quietly deployed special operators there back in late August, just days after the breakout of the civil war. Then, a series of FPV drone strikes hit Wagner and RSF forces in and around the capital region. These strategies and styles of drone attacks are essentially identical to the ones conducted against Russia and Ukraine. In November, videos began being released by what appeared to be Ukrainian special forces stalking the streets of Sudan under thermals and night vision goggles. The videos show a small team of 9 operators clearing alleyways and setting into position before firing a rocket directly into the window of a nearby building that had several enemy fighters inside of it. After a couple more rocket shots, the occupants of the building began firing back. But as the non-thermal view indicates, it's pitch black outside during the attack, and they're essentially shooting blind. Sources within Ukraine's security and defense sectors confirmed these actions. By destabilizing Wagner's security positions and attacking them at vulnerable weak points, they're hoping to cause a disruption of their entire operations in Sudan. They're aiming to force troops to have to put up their own protection and defenses all over the country, which in turn reduces their efficiency and speed at which they can operate. Additionally, the resources spent to send a handful of Ukrainian operators into Sudan is significantly lower than the resources that will be spent now by Russia to protect its own interests. This applies not just in Sudan, but across all countries Russia is currently operating in. What could some of the factors be for why the conflict has drawn both Ukraine and Russia here? Sudan is currently in the midst of a violent civil war. Russia has been dealing with the Sudanese government since 2017, working to both secure things like port access and permissions to build military bases, as well as training Sudanese troops and assisting them in putting down protests. The two warring sides are the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the SAF, under al-Burhan, who are currently still in control of the government. The rebelling side is the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, under Dagalo. Currently, the RSF holds a large portion of the southwestern corner of Sudan, and their control extends north into the capital city. The RSF are also trained and equipped by the Wagner Group, who are working to overthrow the Sudanese government. According to the latest reports from Sudan, about 90% of the arms and ammunition used by the RSF have been directly supplied by Russia. Though Wagner originally supported the sitting government in 2021, the economic incentive of securing resources like gold deposits favored supporting the rebels instead, who were organized under the Rapid Support Forces. Any gold mines gained here are critical resources for Russia. Companies directly tied to Wagner, such as the Morale Gold, are working inside of the Sudan since at least 2017. Part of this effort is in an attempt to hurt Russia's ability to support their war effort materially. One of the mission goals in Africa is to disrupt the broader effort of Russia in the Sahel region. This area south of the Sahara Desert includes countries like Niger, Chad, which are the latest states to kick American troops stationed out and opt for Russian advisors instead. Since the breakout of the invasion, Sudan has been a major ally and supplier of arms and ammunition to Ukraine, especially in the realm of small arms. If Wagner was able to help remove the sitting government in Sudan, they would not only have full access to the nation's raw resources, but cut off supplies to Ukraine to be able to defend themselves as well. Hence, from Ukraine's point of view, the need for intervention. In February of this year, Ukraine's special forces published more videos and information showing they had captured Wagner troops and RSF fighters. 3 prisoners were shown, with one identifying himself as being a member of the Wagner group. It's always difficult to take anything a prisoner says at face value because we don't know if they're answering honestly or not because they're under duress. But the reason I bring it up is because it's more evidence of the war leaking out beyond the borders of Ukraine. This video was a bit more significant than previous ones, as prior to this, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense pulled the classic line of neither confirming or denying having troops in Sudan. In the interrogation video, however, the flag of Ukraine is plainly displayed on an operator's uniform. Since March of this year, we haven't seen any development in Sudan regarding Ukraine's role in the fight, other than roughly 100 operators in the Timar unit that have been working on training SDF forces against the RSF. Many factors are pointing to the collapse of Sudan within the year. But for now, we'll have to see how the fighting in Sudan and Syria plays out. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. If you found anything valuable in this report, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. I really appreciate your support, Spare Parts Army, and I look forward to seeing you again in a few days.